And so we're just going to wait a few more seconds for people to be brought in. And then we'll start.
Guys, do you want me to randomly select author for answer, or you guys tell me? I could just put up a question and you could say.
Yeah, if you throw it out there, we'll sort it out.
Okay.
So good evening, everyone, and welcome to PMP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. We have what promises to be quite an illuminating and entertaining event for you this evening, featuring two very engaging law professors, Michael Heller and James Salzman, and their thought-provoking new book, Mind. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the event, just click on the Q&A icon that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Chat function also at the bottom of your screen will be active as well. But that is for, well, chatting. It's not for asking questions. Put your questions in the Q&A column. But in the chat box, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Mind. Now, Michael teaches property law at Columbia University, and Jim's a leading environmental theorist and teaches environmental law at UCLA. Together, they've tackled the concept of ownership, which on the surface might seem a pretty straightforward subject. I mean, we all have at least an intuitive notion of what belongs to us, right? Well, think again, because as Michael and Jim show, whether we're talking about something physical, spatial, or intellectual, the question of who really has claim to it can quickly get complicated, and the answer can end up being quite different from what we had assumed. Who, for instance, has rights to the space around your seat on an airplane? Who owns the password to your online account? What is a chair in the street that's been put there to hold a parking space for you? Well, why does doing that, putting a chair in a parking space, work, say, in the city of Chicago, but in New York, you're going to lose the chair as well as the space? And why can you sell your blood plasma but not your kidney? These are just a few of the many situations and puzzles addressed in Mind. Now, Michael and Jim give us a really useful framework for thinking about ownership, and not just to help us through the everyday situations we all encounter, but for dealing, say, on a policy level with broader issues like climate change or the social costs of a sharing economy. Mind's really an intriguing and informative book, and it's written in a lively tone. With Mother's Day and Father's Day coming up, let me just say the book would make a great gift. In conversation with Michael and Jim this evening will be Bart Gellman, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who wrote for the Washington Post for more than 2 decades and currently is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's also the author of 2 books, Angler, about the vice presidency of Dick Cheney, and more recently, Dark Mirror, about the Edward Snowden story and the expansion of the US government's surveillance system. So Michael, Jim, and Bart, take it away.
Thank you, Brad. It's great to be back here at Politics and Prose. I love this book. I really enjoyed the hell of it. And I was lucky enough to read Advanced Galleys. And I'm not a big consumer of law books. And I didn't think I was a big consumer of books about property, but this had a way of changing my way of looking at the whole world. I kept finding stories in the newspaper afterward that would remind me of themes of the book. So I want to start with a question that you lead off with in your book as well. And maybe you can settle this for me and my neighbors on airplanes, which is when the light goes off and we're at cruising altitude, and the person in front of me wants to lean their seat way back into my face, and I ask them, would you mind just going back forward a little bit? You're in my tonsils. Who gets to decide? Whose space is that anyway?
I can start off. Thanks, Bart. So it turns out there are actually a lot of fights that actually break out about reclining seats. It's the way you described it, I think, is exactly right. It feels like an intrusion. And one of the things we talk about in the book is that we have these sort of innate senses of what's right and what's not right, but they turn out to be very different. And so if you think about the two basically claims that are going on here, one person, we'll call them the recliner. Their argument basically is, I've got a button, and the button allows me to recline my seat back. And they're basically relying on a story that we call attachment. I own it because it's attached to something I own. The other person, you in the story you told, you're trying to work on your laptop or have a meal or something, and all of a sudden the laptop or the meal are in your lap. And you're making a different claim. Your claim basically is possession. Possession is 9/10 of the law. I possess this space and it's mine. And this is an old principle that goes way back. And one of the things we point out in the book, sort of as a framing, is that it turns out there are only 6 stories that people use to claim everything. And they always have, right? So it's basically, we'll go over these as the evening goes on, but one of them is attachment, one of them is possession, and they're in direct conflict. So here's what's so interesting. We do a lot of public speaking about this issue, and usually we have a polling function. And we ask the audience, should there be a right to recline or a right to defend your knees? And what's remarkable is that it's almost always 50-50. At worst, it's 40-60 one way or the other. And the folks who basically say right to recline or right to defend their knees, they're incredulous that anyone could feel differently, and they're pushing a story. But what's fascinating is that by being angry at each other, they're not angry really at who they should be. So, Michael, you want to take off there?
Right. So the real villain in the story is not the person in front. It's the airlines that have shrunk the pitch on airline seats from 35 inches down to 28. And as they squeeze you tighter and tighter together, that wedge of space becomes ever more valuable. And what that means is by not telling you whether you, Bart, can keep the person out of your lap or not, what they've done is they've been deliberately ambiguous. And that turns out to be one of the most advanced tools of ownership design. And airlines, let me tell you, are very sophisticated designers of space. That's all they have to sell.
But why do they want me and the doofus in front of me to be fighting about the space on the airline seat?
Because what they can do by being ambiguous is have you each feel like it's yours. And they can sell that wedge of space twice. They sell it both to the person in front to recline and to you for your tray table. And what they count on is that you are a pretty polite guy, as I know. And people who are polite, have good manners, try to work it out. So while we're being polite with each other and trying to work it out, the airline is selling that space twice on every seat. And also by having that be so uncomfortable in economy, they've created a market. That's what creates the market for the business class seats up front, where there's more legroom and no hassle. So it turns out to be the airlines taking advantage of these very instinctive, powerful, simple stories, attachment versus possession, in order for them to profit.
And the thing that's interesting is the airlines actually do have a rule, by and large. You can recline, but they don't tell you, right? And they don't enforce it because it's in their interest basically to push off the anger on the passengers and not against the airline itself.
You said something earlier, Jim, that we've all heard before, and I want to know whether you property experts think it's true. Is possession 9/10 of the law?
Well, it depends if you're talking to a 2-year-old or not. So the answer is it depends on the setting, right? So it's no coincidence that mine is one of the first words that kids say in any culture, right? You go to a playground and I promise you within a minute, you're going to hear someone say mine. What's interesting is that there are different reasons for why they're saying that. So you never hear kids in a playground arguing about mine, about a joke or a song, right? We're hardwired to think about ownership in terms of physical, tangible things. And so, possession, imagine you have 2 kids fighting over a shovel, right? They're both saying mine. If you dig a little deeper, it's the same thing as the airplane, right? One is saying possession, I'm holding on to it, just like you, the seat's going into you. The other person is using a different story, which is first in time. I had it first, right? So imagine one kid has a shovel, puts it down, another one picks it up. That's when the fight begins, right? So that's sort of what's happening at the playground, and sort of possession being 9/10 of the law, or the sense. What's fascinating though is that once you move from the playground to the internet, then things get a little fishier. And Michael, I can probably tell you about Amazon.
Right. So possession is 9/10 of the law. That idea actually traces back to the Code of Hammurabi, which is the oldest legal code we know of. It's over 4,000 years old. And that intuition is so powerful and basic in kids and in adults, but it translates very poorly to our online lives. So when you click, when you see a little shopping cart online and you click that buy now button, all of that online design is meant to evoke in you that tangible physical idea that people have about possession. But when you click buy now to download an online book or movie, you're actually getting something much different and much less than you think that you're getting. The buy now button doesn't mean what you think it means. There have been some psychological studies recently showing that almost 90% of us, book buyers, consumers, believe that buying a book online, downloading it onto your Kindle, is the same as buying a hard copy. But it's not. Amazon and Apple can and actually have deleted books right off of people's devices. So the online ownership, what you feel like you own and what you actually own, has a very big gap, big and growing gap between them. And what that means is that each of us pays Amazon and Apple an extra unearned premium on every download. It's why you should buy your books from Politics and Prose, where you actually have a tangible copy. What you own is different and more from the online purchase.
Right, you buy it from Politics and Prose, and you can resell it afterward if you like to.
But don't do that for
or
us.
give it to somebody else to read. And there is a buy link in the chat, as mentioned earlier.
And Bart, one thing to mention actually that sort of plays off of what I was talking about earlier about the sort of intuitions of the playground. We're shifting right now to a very different sense of what ownership means. So we're in online, it's not something tangible. We're shifting really to access to a stream of ones and zeros. And so, for instance, this phone, I own this phone, but it's really just a plastic brick, right? What powers the phone, I don't own. I don't own the operating system. I don't own all the things I've stored on it. And so there really is this sort of major shift going on in terms of what we think we own and what we actually own.
So online, possession turns out to be much closer to 1/10 of the law. So you're asking, is possession 9/10? It has that feeling. It's often the case in the tangible world, but in the online world, the big high-tech companies are evoking our feeling of possession. We still have that primitive sense, a primitive reaction, but the reality is we're paying for that. We're paying for the 9/10, and what we're getting is actually 1/10. And it's that gap that leads to the extra profit for Amazon and Apple.
So we've talked, I think, so far about 3 of the 6 stories that you say explain all ownership.
So let me add 2 more.
Yeah, I was going to.
For example, like to go back to our airplane seat, right? The person in front of you is saying attachment. It's attached. The seat, the wedge is attached to me, and you're saying possession, right? I had it, and you're also saying I was first. I had that wedge of space first before the person reclined.
So those are the three.
Those are 3. So let's move away from that sort of fairly trivial example. I mean, it's important in the moment. It's important when you fly, but let me give you another version of that, which is actually much more consequential. Which who owns your online life? So who owns, for example, your clickstream? Clickstream is the record of your likes and looks when you buy a plane ticket to Chicago for the weekend, and for the following week you get ads everywhere you go on the internet for restaurants and hotels in Chicago. The reason you're getting those ads is that you're being tracked, and your online looks and everything that you do online is being sold to advertisers. That's actually what powers the internet. But that's a new resource, just like that wedge of space is online. So it's up for grabs in exactly the same way. There's ambiguity around ownership in exactly the same way for your most intimate online life. And what Facebook is saying is they're using the same stories as the kids in the playground, the same stories as online. They're saying your data is attached to our apps. They're using the attachment story. And they're also using a 4th story, which is labor. They're saying we should reap where we have sown. The value in the data is our labor in accumulating it and transforming it into something that we can sell. So they're using attachment and labor. But you can say, no, that data I possess it. I had it first. And you can also use another story. You can say it comes from my body. It's part of me. And that's the 5th story, which is self-ownership. So in the online world, in this actual ongoing battle, a battle that every one of us is in the middle of right now for the fate of our online life, that story has attachment and labor on one side, possession first, and self-ownership on the other. And that's already 5 of the 6 stories everyone uses to claim everything in the world. The sixth story, which I hope we have time to get to, is family ownership. It's mine because I'm in the family. And that's
one of
it.
the one of the sort of key takeaways, Brad said this early on, we sort of assume that ownership is a given, right? If you either own it or you don't own it. And one of the things we try to really push hard, both as we teach property and in this book, is that ownership is a storytelling battle. There is no natural correct way or correct answer for who owns what. All these stories are available to us. And Facebook and Amazon don't necessarily own our click streams. We can claim them as well. And because it's a storytelling battle, if you're not telling your story, someone else is telling theirs and basically supplanting your values with theirs.
And these battles take place where? In court?
All over the place, right? I mean, we start off in the playground, right? I mean, the thing is that one of the points you make is that law is both overvalued and undervalued. It's overvalued in the sense that 99.999% of all conflicts over ownership never go to court, right? Never involve a lawyer, right? Think of all the sort of ownership conflicts that go on simply when you fly, right? Reclining, who gets the armrest, can you raise the shade or not, who gets the overhead compartment space, who gets to board first. Those are all ownership conflicts. We don't think about them that way, but they are, right? And none of those ever involve the law. We work it out through customs and norms and things like that. At the same time, law is also undervalued, and we'll talk about this probably later when it comes to things like trust and inheritance and issues like that. So it cuts both ways.
So one of the things that you say in the book that surprised me is that ownership is overrated. What did you mean by that?
So ownership feels like it's something like for lawyers. And that's really something that we try to get our law students, and we hope all of you listening can move away from. Ownership happens, as Jim just said, mostly outside of the law. It mostly happens in daily life. It's, when someone cuts around you at the Starbucks line because they use the app, so they get to be first. Well, what Starbucks is doing there is engineering who's first in time for actually getting the drink in a way that separates people who wait in line from people who use the app. And that's an ownership battle. But you go through hundreds of those ownership battles all day long. So in that sense, law is overrated. Most of the stuff that you fight about all day in your life, hundreds of times a day, is stuff that is outside of the law, where law doesn't tell you the answer, where the answer comes from, I had it first versus I'm holding on to it, and versions of that.
So Bart, just to give one example, let's imagine that you're at the Safeway, right? And you've got your shopping cart full, and Michael, actually someone you don't know, comes up and says, eggs, I've been looking for eggs, and takes the eggs and say, butter, I've been looking for butter too, and takes both of them and then walks away. I mean,
they take them right out of my cart.
Yeah, they take them right out of your cart, and you're in line, but you haven't. So what's your reaction?
Well, that's so interesting because I haven't bought it yet, but I would absolutely consider it wrong to take the eggs from my cart. I would think they were my eggs.
It's outrageous, right? And the question is, as you said, why is that? You haven't bought them. So where does the intuition come from? And it comes from, I think, in part, possessions, non-tenants of the law, and in part labor. You actually did the work of going to the different rows and taking it. The law is not involved there. You're not going to call the cops, right? You're not going to bring this person to court.
And you have no legal claim. You don't actually own it at that point. All you have is a claim based on your mere possession, which is very powerful, but it's not the law.
That's so interesting. You also say elsewhere in the book that ownership is underrated.
So an example for that is actually we have two examples that are really quite salient for all of us listening. One has to do with who gets what in America, who gets wealth in America. So it turns out that family ownership is an area where law is actually extremely important. And we've now created in this country actually two separate legal systems, not metaphorically two systems, two actually different legal systems, one for most of us and a different separate optional system for the super wealthy, not for the 1%, for the 1% of the 1%, who actually now have basically an optional legal system where they can make a lot of taxes voluntary that we have to pay, and where they make a lot of responsibility optional, paying off business partners or children they owe custody payments to, or spouses, or the government. So we have a separate legal system that's an optional one, and it's actually rooted in states like South Dakota. Turns out to be the world's leading money haven today. We can talk about that if you want to go in that direction. That's one area where law really matters, is how the rich stay so rich in this country. And there's a hidden ownership story there. The other big story is a story about climate change.
Let me just stop you for 1 second, because that's automatically intriguing. And we think about secret money caches in Swiss banks or Cayman Island banks. What's South Dakota got to do with it?
Well, actually, those money isn't in Switzerland anymore, or the Caymans. South Dakota today is crushing both Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. The state has become the world's leading money haven. Hundreds of billions of dollars, possibly up to 3 trillion. There's a dispute about how much, because South Dakota keeps it so secret, has gone to South Dakota.
So I'm the 1% of the 1%. And
Praise be.
And I am driving my handmade Lamborghini and knock over an old lady, and someone says I owe a lot of damages. How does this South Dakota shelter help me?
Well, in South Dakota, if you structure your money through South Dakota, so you can do this in Washington, D.C., or New York or California. Actually, South Dakota offers this alternate legal system for people who never visit the state. They never even have to go there to sign papers. Actually, there's almost nobody in the state of South Dakota who even knows the system exists. Jim and I just did a public radio in South Dakota show, and none of the viewers in South Dakota knew about this system. It's actually very, has a lot of money, but not a lot of jobs. So the way it works is they create a kind of trust, which means that if you hit someone with your Lamborghini, you don't have to pay them. You can shelter your assets from tort judgments, from a court saying, you, Bart, owe this person who you mowed down money. If on the other hand, you aren't using one of these trusts and you actually just earn income from labor and you get paid a paycheck, that paycheck can be garnished by the court for many, many years to pay off that judgment. So people who earn money have to pay those judgments. People who get that money through these South Dakota trusts can avoid paying them. It's really shocking once people realize that this actually exists.
And the thing that's remarkable is they actually have the chutzpah to call these things dynasty trusts, because they're literally creating a new wealth aristocracy. I mean, people talk a lot about the wealth gap in the United States. There are a lot of drivers for that. But what makes sure that that's going to endure is the fact that these families can basically pass on the wealth, essentially tax-free, generation to generation.
Forever. Jim and I had an op-ed in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago. The headline was something like, let's rein in the billionaires and start with South Dakota. So South Dakota is really an egregious story. One of the things that people don't necessarily realize is that in America, ownership, property rights, who gets what, is mostly decided at the level of states. It's not federal law by and large, and it's not in the Constitution, which means that one deviant state like South Dakota can offer these dynasty trusts and asset protection trusts, and they offer them to New York and DC and Maryland and Virginia, California residents, places people actually want to live who are quite wealthy, but would prefer, all things considered, not to pay their fair share, to basically avoid responsibility and taxes if they can do so. And South Dakota says, have your money come here, and you can do so. Not one road gets built in South Dakota. There isn't one student in South Dakota who gets educated by the money that falls off of these trusts. No money stays in South Dakota. Only a tiny handful of South Dakota bankers and lawyers make any money off of these trusts.
And what's the incentive for doing the law, for running the law in the first place, if South Dakota doesn't benefit?
Well, it's those lawyers and bankers actually wrote the laws. And it's such a small state that they also are part-time legislators. So they both wrote them and got them passed.
Wow.
There really aren't 100 people in the state who know that these laws exist, and not many more who benefit from them. And what's amazing is that they really are able to, it means everyone else, everyone listening tonight pays more in taxes and gets less in services, every one of you, because of the existence of these trusts. So much taxation is avoided by the most wealthy people through these trusts that it raises the rates for all of us, and we all get less in services.
Can Congress do anything about it?
Yeah, so there are actually, this is, one of the things about ownership is that there are ways that you can sort of deal with all of these stories on a very personal level as a parent sometimes, certainly as a consumer. But some of the places, when you're thinking about ownership, your hat that you're wearing is a citizen hat. So this is an example of law being underrated, where the super wealthy understand how these rules work. And this is one where Congress actually can fairly easily overturn some of the sort of escape hatches that South Dakota has created. So they can, for example, require that these dynasty trusts get taxed in every generation. They can eliminate some of the generation skipping aspects. The details about this are super boring and super technical. And that's actually one of the things super rich people count on, is they hire people to deal with the super boring, super technical pieces that the rest of us mostly don't want to deal with. We could go into the details. Actually, a number of the details in the current Biden tax plan are meant to address exactly these concerns. So the new Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, who's actually in charge of tax policy, has proposed in her earlier writing something called a silver spoon tax, which is to tax the people who inherit great wealth rather than the people who leave it. And there's more sort of consensus in America that sort of idle aristocratic heirs shouldn't be getting massive amounts of money without responsibility.
That's interesting. I want to remind you that in the audience that the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen will let you queue up questions now that I will ask later in the conversation. And if you wait till the last minute, we may not get to it. There's something counterintuitive in your book about tolerated theft, that theft, permitting a certain amount of theft is a business strategy for some companies. Explain that.
Sure. So Michael and I both teach property, and we'll ask our law students, how many of you, either yourselves, use someone's HBO password or know someone who's basically shared their password? And every single hand goes up. It's like a forest of hands. We then ask them, how many of you know this is illegal? And a little over half go up. And these are law students, right? So what they're doing is not legal-ish. What they're doing is illegal, right? The terms of service, you can't do that. Arguably, it's a federal crime, depending on how you read one of the statutes. And yet, not only do we go ahead and do that and not really care, HBO doesn't care either. And in fact, HBO, it goes beyond that. HBO actually is glad, encourages that we're sharing our passwords. So how can that be? Well, HBO could very easily find out whether we're sharing passwords or not. The reason they don't is that, in the words of their former CEO, Richard Plepler, they're trying to build what he called video addicts. It's a nice turn of phrase. And essentially, what he's trying to do is to get more and more people watching Game of Thrones and their other shows to basically build the brand. And the idea is that people know that the password sharing is not exactly kosher. And as they get older and with more means, they'll basically get their own passwords. Now, what's interesting is Netflix has followed this general model as well. They're starting a beta right now that some of the folks watching tonight may have had happen to them, where they send a gentle reminder if you're using it in more than one place. They're not sanctioning you yet. Now, of course, they could take the approach that the recording industry took. You may remember this about, I guess, 20 years ago now. They filed tens of thousands of lawsuits against students and everyday Joes, basically slamming them. And it didn't work. Music downloading continued, and they realized that attacking your fan base is probably not the best strategy. But it's not just HBO which tolerates theft. There's some really interesting research that's been done on the sort of the knockoff luxury goods, right? So you might think that that Rolex, for example, you go to Times Square and you say, "Look, I got my $30 real Rolex," and they say Rolex would think that's terrible. There's some studies that have been done that actually show that increases Rolex shares, and I forget the number, Michael. I think it's around 40% or something.
That's right.
Of those basically who bought the knockoffs end up buying the real thing later. The attraction of the knockoffs basically trains people that later on, when they have more means, as with HBO, they'll get the real thing. And this plays out in a lot of other ways as well.
So this is actually one of the real sort of surprising features of ownership at the cutting edge of business today, which is that you think, if you invent something, get a patent. If you write something, get a copyright. charge what you can for what you own, get the most rights you can. Much of that wisdom in the business world turns out to be wrong. The cutting edge of business actually has a very different attitude towards ownership, towards the law of ownership than you might anticipate. So we talked already about airlines using the strategy of deliberate ambiguity as a way to profit. And the example we're talking about now with HBO is at the cutting edge, and they're encouraging theft of their core product. They're using tolerated theft as a customer acquisition strategy. And it's not just HBO and Netflix. Disney is doing the same thing. Disney used to be the most hyper-aggressive company in America about defending its trademark and copyrights. Woe to the nursery school that would paint an unauthorized Mickey on the wall. Literally, Disney's lawyers would come after them anywhere they were in the country. But today, Disney realized they actually make more money by tolerating theft, by enforcing property rights less. So what they now do is they look around at pirate fan websites. So one of our favorite ones is a woman named Bibbidi Bobbidi Brooke, who came up with these rose gold sequined Mickey Mouse ears on her superfan pirate site that was a big hit in her superfan pirate world. Disney absolutely could have shut her down. They were within their rights to do so, and they chose not to. What they did instead is they used her as a cheap form, a crowdsourced form of product R&D. They said, this is a great idea that we didn't come up with. And they took her sequined Mickey Mouse ears and put them in the official Disney stores where they were a huge hit. And this has become Disney's new strategy for product R&D, which is tolerating a lot more theft. So tolerated theft, deliberate ambiguity, basically foregoing ownership rights in many contexts, are strategies that the cutting edge of business now use to engineer ownership in ways that are actually quite profitable and quite counterintuitive.
I mean, it's interesting. You look at, I mean, the assumption, I think, always has been creators need to control their creations, right? Otherwise, they can't make money. And in some areas, that's clearly true, but in a lot of areas, it's not. So think about stand-up comedians. Think about chefs with recipes. Think about designers, right? It's very rare that you can actually patent or copyright a design, actually patent a design. And you know, the fact is, we come up with new sports plays all the time. We come up with new fashion designs all the time. There are a number of areas that are incredibly dynamic with no ownership protections at all.
Martin Luther King makes an appearance in the book. Explain.
So Martin Luther King, for most of us, if you sort of think of the image of Dr. King, at least for me, I think of him giving the I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with 250,000 people. That speech, when he gave it, his lawyer later copyrighted that speech. So when you see, and it turns out that King's estate today, still 50 years after Dr. King's death, still tightly controls every aspect of every word that he said, and that was later copyrighted. So for example, if you want to use an image of Dr. King, they will stop you without getting paid. If you want to quote one of his speeches, so say, for example, think about the movie Selma by Ava DuVernay. It sounds a lot like Dr. King in the movie, but there isn't one word that he said in there. She couldn't license his speeches. She'd already the King estate had licensed them already to Steven Spielberg, who didn't make the movie. But it turns out that we have a system of ownership in this country of expression that is very out of whack, where it is possible to own things decades, now almost a century after they're first written. Mickey Mouse is still under copyright today, almost 95 years after he was first drawn by Walt Disney in the early 1920s. It's outrageous that copyright is as long as it is.
It was supposed to expire automatically after a fixed term.
It was supposed to expire 40 years ago. And then Disney went to Congress and bought a 20-year term extension, which extended not just Mickey Mouse, but all copyrights in America for 20 more years. And then when that was going to expire 20 some years ago, Disney went back to Congress and bought 20 more years. So what that means is that today, most of the culture of America, all of the great flowering of American novels, poetry, dance, film, all of that from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, all that material that would have been in the public domain, including King's speeches, all of that is still locked up under copyright, and most of it is lost. We have no access to the ability even to bring this stuff back into circulation because the owners of it have become lost to time. So nobody dares reprint many of those old novels. There's actually more of American culture available from the late 1800s than there is from the middle part of the 20th century. It is an amazing price that we all pay for Mickey Mouse being able to get a few extra decades of protection for the Disney company, which is the destruction of a whole swath of American culture. All of us here as authors, we benefit from copyright, but we are given many more rights than we should have and many more rights than is good for America.
Because when you think about it, the whole goal of copyright is to create an incentive for more creation. Walt Disney died a long time ago, right? Walt Disney is not going to come up with any more characters, and yet the Disney estate still controls this. Dr. Martin Luther King, he died obviously almost 52 years ago, more than that. And yet his estate, basically when the folks who are watching this, you go to the Martin Luther King Memorial down on the mall, they had to pay the foundation to put the quotes up. They actually had to change the name of the fundraising arm. It was called the MLK Memorial, I think was the actual name they used. Then it just became the Memorial Foundation because they were threatened they would have had to pay to use his name as part of the foundation raising money for his memorial.
So the thread here is this is another, we have these two threads. Ownership is overrated in many contexts, tolerated theft, deliberate ambiguity. This is the other story where ownership is, underrated. It actually matters that we have copyright law. That's bad law. That was badly designed. It's not something that you individually can worry about, but it is, again, part of what you worry about as a citizen is the hidden costs of really dumb and bad ownership design. So we lose a lot of culture. We also have patent law that is too expansive. And that means that we lose a lot of potential life-saving drugs, for example, that could exist, that would exist if we had a smarter patent law system. So overprotection of property turns out can be as costly for each one of us, for drugs to treat disease that could and should exist and don't, because we have too many ownership rights rather than too few.
Talk to me about ownership and environmental protection, ownership and climate change. What connection do they have?
Sure, it actually turns out to be a very tight connection, even though you wouldn't think so on its face. I mean, one of the claims we make in the book, which I think is correct, is that we actually can protect the environment more if we can own more things in the environment, which is kind of a weird thought. But let's sort of think about climate change. So one of the big drivers of climate change is deforestation, loss of forest, and it's a double whammy. It's double whammy in part because forests play a big role in sequestering and sucking up carbon from the atmosphere. And it's a double hit when you have deforestation, sort of slash and burn, because the carbon that's trapped in the trees is released and you no longer have trees to take up the carbon. Why is that happening? Well, it's happening primarily because the people who control the land aren't getting any money. They don't own the services that they're providing to us by sequestering carbon. And so the challenge for battling climate change is how do you make the trees worth more standing than cut down? And the way you can do that is something we call as-if ownership. It's a variant of the attachment principle we were talking about earlier. And so what international policy has done, and something called REDD or REDD Plus, is they basically treat the forest owners as if they own the carbon they're sequestering, and they pay them basically to reduce the rate of deforestation. Norway has pumped billions of dollars into doing this. Very same strategy is being used to protect fisheries. So you may be familiar with the reality TV show, The Deadliest Catch. This basically is a show where this Alaskan crab boats would go out into the Bering Sea, and it really was the deadliest catch. It turned out in the early 2000s, it was more dangerous to be working the crab boats than to be on foot patrol in Iraq. Right, why was that? Well, the fisheries basically first come, first served. The season opened, and the first to catch to fill that quota for the season got the crabs, and when the quota was reached, the season ended. So as an incentive, it's called fishing derby, to get out there as fast as possible, which is why it was so dangerous. Basically, the folks in Alaska and other fisheries in the country said, this doesn't make any sense. They looked at Iceland, who basically created a very similar kind of property ownership approach. And what they said was, we're going to allow boats to own part of the season's catch up front. And so if the weather's bad, you can stay in port. If the price of the crabs are low, you can stay in port. We can go out when the weather's safer or when the price is higher. And this is called catch shares. And this now is used all over the world. And there are other examples I could give you as well. It explains why New York City has the best tap water in the country. In all these cases, what's in common is basically allowing either fishing boats or landowners to basically own the benefits that they provide us right now for free. It gives an incentive to manage their land for the common good.
Go ahead. Why
just
such great tap water? That sounds interesting.
Yeah, so New York City basically since the early 1900s has been getting its tap water from the Catskill Mountains about 100, 110 miles away. It's basically piped down to the Croton Reservoir. And then with minimal treatment, just some chlorination and some filters to keep out sticks and dead bodies and such. From there, the water basically goes to the taps all around. I was joking about the dead bodies. It goes to the taps all around Manhattan. In the 1980s, the quality started to be threatened because there was more development up in the watershed. It looked like they were going to have to build a multi-billion-dollar treatment plant. But a guy called Al Appleton, he worked for New York City, he was a water guy. He said, wait a minute, let's think about this in terms of ownership. Just as with climate change, the landowners in the Catskills were not getting any benefit from basically having clean water flow off their land. And so, no surprise, they were developing their land so the water was dirtier, right? Why do otherwise? New York City basically did what has been happening with climate, and they paid the landowners as if they owned the clean water coming off the land. They basically changed the incentive structure for the landowners, and they essentially have insured with something called a green bond, right? They invested in natural infrastructure instead of built infrastructure. They invested in sort of green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure. In New York, since 1992, every 5 years, the EPA keeps saying your water quality is great, right? You don't have to build a treatment plant. And it's all because of ownership engineering.
The story there is, they switched from first come, first served to attachment. It's the same story as that wedge of space on the airline. It's the same 6 simple stories. They work for the airline, they work for your clickstream, and they also are the tools that we have to solve climate change. There isn't some other set of stories available. It's the same 6 simple stories that everyone, governments and businesses, are using to both create and solve sort of the biggest problems around us.
So I'm going to keep asking questions. I'm going to be asking some now from the audience Q&A, and there's some fun ones. We're going to have to get to NFTs. Somebody says, what do you own if you bought the Beeple digital collage? What's your thinking on non-fungible tokens? And maybe for beginners, what the heck are they?
Okay, so some of you know what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is this online currency where you mine it. They're miners who create it by solving complicated math problems, using a lot of energy to solve problems. And they create basically virtual money, cryptocurrency. That's fungible money. One Bitcoin is the same as every other Bitcoin. A non-fungible token is a Bitcoin, essentially the equivalent of, but that's attached to a specific thing. So it's basically a way to authenticate that this is the original version of some online thing. So you can think about it in terms of like the Mona Lisa. There's one original Mona Lisa and a lot of postcards. But the original has got that special quality. For online art, everything's an original. They're all exact replicas of each other. There's no such thing as an original in the online world. So what an NFT does is create an artificial way to say, this particular version is the original, one that I authenticate, that Beeple authenticates. My understanding of NFTs is that what they're doing is they're taking one of our most creative, one of our most democratic media of art, which is the online art world, and transforming it into a place for sort of speculative frenzy. So it brings together the worst of art and the worst of blockchain. So blockchain, Bitcoin, these are incredibly energy intensive form of online technology. So we're sort of wasting a tremendous amount of electricity for this pernicious end, which is creating a sort of speculative game for the same tech bros in their basement who have too much money accumulated during this pandemic, and they're finding some new outlet for it. So my sense, as someone who watches this fairly carefully, is that NFTs are more likely to be in the realm of Ponzi scheme than in the realm of gold fields.
But realize the thing that's interesting is that it's very clever ownership engineering. By linking, the blockchain and this digital art that anyone can copy, right? It's all ones and zeros. Suddenly there's something that can be owned. Now, whether there's demand for that is another question. And obviously at the moment there is.
So here's a provocative question with maybe a little touch of grievance behind it. Who really owns my paycheck or wealth, me or the government?
So I probably should answer this because I think it's my cousin who asked who asked this question. It's a complicated question because there are all kinds of rules that we live by, in our society, right? So the question is, if I own my paycheck, why is there any taxation at all? If I own my assets, why can't I leave everything to future generations? Basically, we're talking about dynasty trust. And my answer, and Michael may have a different one, is we live in a social contract. All right, the money that we have is issued by the government. The contracts that we sign are enforced by the government, and there's a deal. And the deal is that in exchange for a currency we can count on and legal mechanisms that allow us to basically, own and sell and such, we have sort of reciprocal obligations. Paying taxes is one of those. Limits on what we can leave to others is another. People obviously are going to argue about where the line should be drawn. But the idea that that we own money irrespective of society, to me, doesn't make sense because money wouldn't have value irrespective of society. Michael, I don't know if you have a different take.
I would just to build on that. For me, this goes back to the Bible. So whether you come from a Jewish or a Christian or Islamic tradition, there's a very deep notion in the Bible of social responsibility built into ownership. So when farmers plow their fields, they're forbidden from going back and picking up the sheaves of grain that fell behind. Those are for the poor. When they harvest their olives, they're not permitted to go back and pick up the olives that were left behind. They're for the poor. And what that says, and this is true in all religious traditions, all Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, is that when you own property, your field, a portion of it is not yours. A portion of it, it's not that you're giving charity, it's just that it's not yours to begin with. And so that very basic notion in the Bible, I think, is sort of congruent with what Jim was just saying about the social contract, that you have a share of what you earn is not yours. Not that it's being taken from you, it's not that it's charity, it's that it wasn't yours to begin with. And that, so what the portion of that should be is very much up for grabs. In America, under American law, going all the way back to the founding, the notion that you can devise money, that you can leave money to your children at all, is not necessarily part of your property right. That is a privilege that the government chooses to give you or not give you at different, and they can limit how much you can give. That's not something new. That goes all the way back in the Anglo-American tradition. The right to inheritance is itself a choice that the government makes about how much to let you devise.
So it's not a natural right. It's a legal construct.
Well, right. So ownership is, in general, substantially a legal construct. But this particular piece of it, the notion that you should be able to leave money to your children, is a choice that states have made at different points in American history that can be overridden or can be limited by the government. It's that limit that became the basis for estate taxes over 100 years ago.
So the United States got to the moon first. Do we own the moon?
When the United States went to the moon, Congress actually passed a law just in advance of the US landing on the moon, saying that when we land there and plant a flag, we are not using that flag as a statement of American ownership of the moon, like the European powers did when they planted flags in America. And like Russia did just a few years ago, when Russia planted a titanium flag just underneath the North Pole. The Russians are claiming the North Polar seas, and they're doing that by planting a flag. But the US expressly disclaimed ownership of the moon. They said, this flag, this American flag, stands for the claims of all humanity. So the US, as a matter of law, disclaimed ownership. Now, that's not the end of the story, because the US, in the last couple of years, has sanctioned private mining companies to go, take what they want from the moon and from asteroids. And they're doing that outside of any international legal regime.
You touched a nerve with the airline story, and someone wants to know how it is that an airline can sell you a ticket and then bump you from the flight. Didn't you buy a seat on that flight?
The answer is no, you didn't. What you bought is basically a lottery ticket that usually gets you a seat. And there's sort of become fairly dense regulation around the ability of airlines to oversell, to overbook seats, and the compensation that you get when you get bumped. But the compensation isn't the inconvenience to you. It's a fixed amount that is set by the airline. So your ticket does not guarantee you a seat. Sorry about that. Actually, I have some concrete advice. Actually, when you're on, this is actually for you, Bart. When you're on a plane and someone is going to lean into you, there's been some studies on this. Don't offer them $20. It doesn't usually work. And don't ask them not to lean into you. That doesn't usually work either. But there is a strategy that works 3/4 of the time. And for those of you who are listening, you should know this. 3/4 of the time, if you offer to buy the person in front of you a drink or a snack, which costs much less than $20, 3/4 of the time they'll take the drink or snack and won't lean back into you. That by offering the drink or the snack, by sort of sharing food or drink, you bring them into community with you, and that community overrides a lot of the other norms about ownership around that space.
Now, this whole conversation was worth it for that advice alone.
There you go.
I've got a question. Where to get here? It says, "Thank you for your wonderful readable book. Can you talk about why you decided to write it and what the writing experience was like?" I'm also interested in how two authors write one book.
Yeah,
So
no,
this is a friend of mine writing in. So hello, Virginia. We, both Jim and I, had written popular books before this one. Jim wrote an amazing book called About Drinking Water. And I wrote a book about what I call the Gridlock Economy, about too much ownership. And we both were looking around for a next book to do. And Jim actually came to me and said, listen, a friend of his had said, why isn't there a book like Freakonomics for ownership? Like Freakonomics, when you read Freakonomics, it's basically a bunch of lessons in microeconomic theory, but filtered through the super fun stories. So ownership is just as fundamental, but people think of it as something for lawyers and something that's boring, something that's far away. So why don't we do a book that shows that this is actually available to each of us, to every one of us, and it's fun and it's infuriating and it's counterintuitive in just the same way as Freakonomics and Tipping Point is. So that became our mission, was to write that. And we're on Jim and I are on different coasts, but for years now we've been auditioning stories. The story has to be fun, it has to be counterintuitive, has to be infuriating, and preferably all three to make it into the book. So we auditioned stories, wrote them up, traded them back and forth, taught them in our classes, tried to think about like what would be an engaging way to make a story that people would actually want to read. And the way we work together is we basically we both love to write. We both write a lot. And so we've been trading drafts, hundreds of drafts back and forth, literally hundreds, on each chapter, and slowly iterating it towards a final structure, a final story, sort of polishing the prose together. It's been actually a tremendous amount of fun working back and forth this way for many years now.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd add, that's exactly right. And the other thing I'd add is that as teachers, the greatest satisfaction you can get as a teacher is when your students just suddenly get the aha moment. And it's like, oh, so that's how it all fits together. It's kind of with a matrix when suddenly, you're able to pick apart everything as all ones and zeros. And I promise you, with ownership, once you start looking for ownership, things will snap into focus. Things that didn't make much sense before suddenly make a lot of sense. Like the story of someone taking something out of Bart's shopping cart. All of a sudden, you can figure out exactly why you get that strong reaction, or how to address climate change. Suddenly makes a lot more sense once you think about it through the prism of ownership.
There's a piece of the book where you start talking about development of pharmaceutical breakthroughs and medical drugs. And the law changed in 1980, and that led to profound changes in the way drugs are developed. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So it used to be the case that research scientists, the way that they got rewarded was through tenure and through reputation. So most basic science research in America for the century, when we had the great inventions, penicillin, polio vaccine, it was all done in the public domain. It was all done through government funding and university labs. In 1980, we switched fundamentally how science is done in this country. The idea was to create patent rights to allow patents in very basic scientific research, the stuff that universities used to do. So now when a university professor does a research project, they always create a spin-off that patents what otherwise would have been public. So the gamble was that by patenting it, you would get biotech investment, you would turbocharge basic science research. So that's actually been true to a point. There's been an enormous investment in this country in basic biomedical research in the last 40 years. But there was a paradox. As we created a multiplicity of rights, of patents in basic scientific research, in the basic methods and knowledge that used to be publicly available, what we missed is that in order to actually get a pill in a bottle that treats disease, drug companies need to assemble hundreds, sometimes more of those patents. So each individual patent might make sense, but when you need to assemble a bunch of them, what drug companies discovered is that they couldn't do it. So many promising areas of drug research, drugs that could have been invented, that should be available to treat disease, don't exist because pharmaceutical companies had to move away from areas of research where there was what's called a patent thicket, too many patent owners creating too little of the resource. It's actually an ownership phenomenon that I discovered some 25 years ago. And the first application, actually a co-author and I wrote an article in Science that then led to changes in patent policy around this, starting around 20 years ago, that we actually created too much ownership in the biomedical area. And it was starting to have really very costly consequences. It hasn't been fully fixed, but this is one of the paradoxes of ownership, that you can have too many property rights, just like you can have too few. And it's devastatingly costly for us in the biomedical area.
It's an interesting question here, and I'm going to make this the last question, I'm sorry to say, because we're running out of time. It says that in our conversation so far, and this person's read your book and loved it, the examples are all about things that people want to own, and wonders whether your arguments apply to things that people want not to own, like the pollution that they've created or emissions from their car.
Yeah, well, I mean, that explains a lot of environmental problems, right? It's the economist's fancy term for that is a negative externality. Essentially, because you produce something that you're not responsible for, you don't worry about producing it, right? If you're belching smokestacks or causing all kinds of harm, and you don't basically have to effectively own the consequences of that, you're going to keep polluting. And so it's a very insightful question. It explains most of environmental law. You know, environmental law is trying to reverse that and essentially make the polluters own the problems that they've created.
Well, that's fantastic. Look, this is a great book. I recommend anybody buy it and read it. It requires no prior knowledge. It's terrific. And
I want to also make a plug for Bart's book. Bart's most recent book, Dark Mirror, is an absolutely fantastic read. If you haven't already read it, you should go and buy his book as well.
Hey, great moderating too, Bart. Let me know how your next airplane trip goes and what happens to your seat.
I know exactly what I'm going to do.
Yeah, we can see this one coming. Yeah, and Michael and Jim, I mean, really fascinating stuff. I love that central idea of ownership being a storytelling battle. Of course, my most favorite point of the evening is hearing you say that buying a physical book is a much more certain way of keeping it than buying an ebook version from Amazon. So I need to figure out a way to turn that fact into some kind of advertisement. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of mine. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well, and well read.
Thanks.
Good night all.